How about now? Okay. So what I was saying was, this is an area that I knew nothing about until about 6 years ago. I now manufacture meditation and healing pyramids. That's what got me started on this research, specifically David Wilcock, for those of you who know him. About 6 years ago, he did a series on Gaia TV about the Russian pyramids, and that's how I got started. So what you're going to find out today is information that wasn't released from Russia. David didn't know it. So I've been working on, how does this stuff work? I'm a scientist, so I want to know, why is it that these pyramids can have the, can't hear you. Okay, let's see if we can, I'll hold it. How's that? All right, can you hear me better now? All right, all right. So what, what motivated me again? I knew these pyramids worked. I've done a lot of experiments with them. So that's what this research is all about. So on the front slide here, I wrote a book earlier this year called 76.345, Exploring the Hidden Secrets of the Golden Ratio. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. The first thing that I want to start this with a brief quote from George Orwell, because I think this will set the tone for what we're going to be talking about. And Orwell said, "Who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past." Because what we're going to be talking about today is a classic example of fake history. We're going to find out that sacred geometry, not only is it in all of the objects in nature, but it's in our architecture and has been for thousands of years, and yet we know nothing about it. Have you ever wondered why we don't learn about sacred geometry in school? Anybody have any ideas? That's right. They don't want us to know. There is specific information that I'm going to be showing you today, that specific geometries can create health, they can create free energy and the like. And prior civilizations have known about this, and we don't. So here are two major reasons why sacred geometry is important. Sacred geometry demonstrates that our physical reality is produced via a precise interplay among mathematics, geometry, harmonics, and proportion, using the golden ratio, or Phi, which is a shortcut name for it, as the universal scaling unit, and consciousness, our thinking, our thought, as the creative engine for that experience. Once we understand this, you cannot escape the fact, and this is important fact number one, that our physical reality is the creation of a higher universal intelligence, or God, and that we control that reality through our thinking and our collective consciousness. And that's a huge difference in worldview. And worldview is so important. If we don't know who we are, where we came from, we are controlled so much more easily by the global elite. The second idea is that the proper application of these principles creates free energy, improved health and immune function, increased agricultural production, environmental remediation, quicker manifestation, for those of you into that, and enhanced psi abilities, whether that be remote viewing, mediumship, telepathy, and the like. So all of this is extremely well documented in the information that David Wilcock gave to us about 6 years ago in summary form. Unfortunately, that information and the research that supports it was not allowed to be published in the United States. So quickly, what is sacred geometry? Sacred geometry is what describes the fundamental laws which create everything in our existence. These laws unite consciousness and matter, as well as science and spirituality. Now, you might ask, what do I mean by uniting consciousness and matter? How many of you out there think that your thoughts, at least in part, help to create your experience? Then how many of you must realize there has to be a process. This isn't magic. Magic is just the science that we don't yet understand. So what I'm going to do is to give you a brief glimpse as to at least what I have figured out so far in terms of the creative process. But one of the primary tenets of sacred geometry is that geometry, mathematics, and harmonics are all directly involved in the miracle of creation. So quickly, what is the golden ratio? The golden ratio, or phi, is nature's natural scaling ratio. So let's think through this thing. If you have a very high frequency thought and you want to convert that down, there has to be a scaling mechanism to take that vibration and to transform it, transmute it into our physical experience. And the only number that works in this equation in the box, A is to B as A plus B is to A. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you were trying to scale something bigger, just like in the Fibonacci sequence, that's why I have think Fibonacci here, 0 and 1, you add those together, you get the next number of 1. You add 1 and 1 together, you get 2. And you use the same process to go from big to small. So the Fibonacci formulas, that sequence, is really the fundamental process that I theorize is the way that the universe is created. Let's see. So what is 76,345? That is a specific angle associated with what's called in this world three-dimensional Phi scaling. This is a phenomenon that's been researched and demonstrated by Nassim Haramein. Any of you know him out there? And Dan Winter as well. They've both come to the demonstrated conclusion that the entire universe, from the subatomic up to the galactic, is scaled with the golden ratio. So how do you derive this 76,345? Well, here's how I did it. The Russian pyramids were not, the geometry of those was never disclosed by the Russians, and I'm not sure that they could have gotten them published, as I said earlier, in the United States. So all this information I had to derive on my own. So what I did, I started by taking a protractor app and measuring what's called the slant angle of the Russian pyramids. And that was 76.345 degrees. Now, I didn't know if that was significant in a cosmological or sacred geometric perspective. But what I did on the left, I took a bunch of circles in 2 dimensions. You could do this in 3 dimensions as well and get the same result. But I took some circles, started with one with a diameter of 1 at the bottom, and then I divided that by phi, or 1.618. I divided that by phi, got 382,236, and so forth. That could go to infinity. And hopefully I'm not going to lose all y'all, because this is about the end of the math. So when you draw the pyramid sides, or in this case, triangle in 2 dimensions around it, you can figure the geometric angle at the base here, and that is 76,345. So it perfectly matched the geometry of the Russian pyramids. So I knew that I was heading off in the right direction. Now, another thing that showed me that I was clearly in the right ballpark was, a lot of you know, or I get this question all the time, how come your pyramids look so different than the Great Pyramid of Giza? They're so much steeper. And they are a lot steeper. But there's a critical thing to point out, and that is that they share a common angle of 76.345 degrees. Most people know that the slant angle of the Giza pyramids is 51.828 degrees. But what most people don't know is that the apex angle, which I'm showing here with my cursor at point E, that's the apex angle of the Giza pyramid, is exactly the same as the slant angle of the Russian pyramids. So just to kind of show you how that works, you could turn the Giza pyramid over on its side like that, and the angles measure up perfectly. So again, further confirmation that this is right. Now I started to find 76,345 in natural phenomena. One of those is the refraction of light. If you take a sphere, glass sphere, put it in the end of a tube, shine light through it, the light refracts through that sphere at exactly 76.345 degrees. A way to look at it in the audio spectrum, we can't see sound necessarily unless we go through an intermediary like cymatics, but we can measure the geometry of an object that we know amplifies that sound, and that's the megaphone. So it also is 76.345 degrees. It's in our DNA as well. And that is profound in and of itself. Another way to find it, for those of you who are into cosmology, know what the torus is. This is actually a perfectly spherical, except for the top and bottom, torus, which is given out for what's called a fundamental physics prize. But I know that it is perfectly spherical on the sides and except for the top and bottom. And it has 76.345 as well. So we're finding it everywhere in nature. Now I want to show you that mankind has known about this forever. So we're going to start, these are what are called Nirajis. They're found in the island of Sardinia in the Mediterranean Sea. There are approximately 10 to 20,000 of these with this exact geometry located on this island. Interestingly enough, this island is a blue zone, which means that it has the longest life expectancy of any place on Earth. This isn't an accident, folks. Here are similar stone structures that were found in Scotland. These were built about, well, I should go back. These Nirajis could date back, according to certain dating methodologies, as far as 350,000 years ago. Wow, is right. Now, the Brochs in Scotland have, again, same geometry, and these date back a little bit into the BCE era by about 500 to 1,000 years. So we found them there. This is a classic example, the Great Zimbabwe Ruins. These are in Zimbabwe in Africa. Michael Tellinger and Dr. Sam Osmanagich recently measured the level of ionization that surrounds this conical structure, and it was the highest that they had ever measured for any of the ancient sites that they had measured. Once again, I'm going to say it's a combination of the geometry plus the building materials that are causing that to occur. Castles all over the world and forts end up having this geometry as well. That indicates to me, I think we need to start thinking. None of these structures people have not been able to figure out their purposes. We attribute or ascribe a purpose to these castles and forts of, playing cowboys and Indians and stuff behind these. I think that is a square wave, and I think that that is used to transmit and or receive energy from other places on the planet. Here are some of the first examples that I ever found, which are the Hindu temples. This is called a Dravidian or Southern Indian Hindu temple style, but all of the Southern Indian temples have this geometry as well. They knew about this. In Northern India, it's called a Nagara style. This is the Virupaksha temple in Northern India. The Northern style, and we're not going to get into this, but it also demonstrates an extreme knowledge of fractals. And fractals, it all comes together. And I go into the math and the geometry in the book. But Buddhist temples, here's one in Sri Lanka. There's numerous examples of this. This structure, as well as the Hindu temples before, were probably energy power plants in their previous incarnation. And there's a great YouTube researcher named Praveen Mohan who demonstrates that in a number of videos. So if you're interested, follow up with that. Here's a pagoda in China that has this geometry. Here's the synagogue that has this geometry. And here's a mosque that has it. This is the Great Mosque of Samara, which is in Iraq. Most of you realize that Iraq today was formerly Babylonia or Babylon. And what I found interesting, there's a whole chapter in the book almost every painter who painted the Tower of Babel ended up using this precise geometry in depicting the Tower of Babel. If you look at that, I wonder whether or not some of this information isn't perhaps from this very mosque in Iraq. And maybe this was the Tower of Babel at one point, don't know. Here's some examples of Scandinavian churches. These are called Stav churches, primarily in Norway, but these were built in about 900 AD and predated the Gothic cathedrals by about 400 years. So they all have it as well. Now I'm going to talk about Gothic cathedrals. This is perhaps in the West the best example we have of sacred geometric principles being employed in architecture. The architects of these temples, or excuse me, of these cathedrals, all knew about sacred geometry. Approximately 2/3 of the cathedrals have this very geometric angle in them. The vast majority of the other angles are other sacred geometry, golden ratio related geometries as well. So they knew about all of this 500 years ago, and we don't know about it now. What happened? Good question. Here's a more contemporary example, the Washington National Cathedral. It has this geometry as well. I'm going to just digress here, but this will give you some examples. Here's an example of an early 20th century American church steeple. Now, my brother is a Lutheran minister, so I've contacted him. I've contacted Luther Seminary in St. Louis. I've tried to find out if the church, there is no information in contemporary churches about the history and the sacred geometry of their own buildings. So he didn't know anything about this, but this geometry disappeared shortly at the beginning of the 20th century. Not a single manufacturer of church steeples in the United States makes this geometry anymore. Castles all over the world have this geometry as well. As you all probably know, I mean, there's no plumbing in these things. We see these gigantic furnaces, but there's no wood. And so how did they do this? If you'll notice, there's what's called antiquitech at the top of all of these towers. And this is, again, the 76-345 geometry. So my theory is that somewhere or another, they were harvesting free energy from these towers. Here's an example of bell towers from around the world. This is the San Marco Bell Tower in Venice. It has this geometry, as we saw earlier from the megaphone. That's done because it amplifies sound and it'll carry a lot further distance. Here's some mystery school architecture. This is called the Knights Templar Church in London. It shows this geometry. Here's an interesting one. The Iranian Parliament building, this is a contemporary structure. Behind their podium, they have a pyramid with this geometry as well. So this is known around the world. Here's an example in Germany. This is called the Oberbaum Bridge in Berlin, Germany. Has this geometry as well. Wouldn't it all be surprised if this wasn't used as a free energy generator as well at some point in the past? Tower Bridge in London, once again, same geometry. Looks like perhaps some common knowledge here all over the world, and that's exactly what did occur that we don't know about. Obelisks, all of the Egyptian obelisks, the tops have this geometry as well. It's interesting that more recent obelisks, such as the Washington National Monument, it's not actually an obelisk because the top is in more than one piece. However, it does not have this geometry, so that wisdom has been lost. Here's an example of one of the Smithsonian Institution buildings that has this geometry. Memorial Hall at Harvard University. This is an example of college and university buildings that have this. Here's an example of the new Ottawa City Hall in Canada. They built Ottawa was definitely for those of you who know about Tartaria, it was definitely a Tartarian city, plenty of Tartarian architecture there, but they replicated it in their new city hall and built a pyramid as well. Close to us here, the Broad Street Station in downtown Philadelphia had this geometry as well. Show you a few examples of Tartarian architecture. We're not going to talk much about that, but this is theorized to have been a worldwide civilization that covered, if not the entire world, virtually the entire world. There are maps from the 17th century that show it encompassing not only current day Russia, but India, China, the Middle East, North America, Central America, and possibly the whole world as well. So this is one of the towers around the wall surrounding the Kremlin. And most of those towers around the Kremlin have this geometry. Here's St. Basil's Cathedral. Many of us think of this as the Kremlin because this is what we see on the nightly news whenever there's a piece of, from Moscow. However, this is Tartarian architecture, and you can see that this 76-345 geometry is there. I don't know if you can see this in the back, but in the close-up on the right, you can see a bunch of wires coming off of that cross. Interestingly enough, all of the Abrahamic religions, the crescent from Islam, the Star of David, and the Christian cross are all great fractal antennas, interestingly enough. So here we have an example of this in Egyptian hieroglyphs. This particular hieroglyph is translated to mean give. I would say, given what we now know about this energetically, that it might be better to translate it as give off or emit, because that's really what's going on here. Here's a picture of the Mayan calendar. And you'll notice this blow up on the right-hand side. Does that look exactly like the example in Egypt? Of course it does. And here's another example, Steve Quayle, for those of you who know him. He just did a documentary on the Egyptian and alien connections in the Americas. And this came actually from the trailer. I stopped it and went back because it looked like that artifact that they're digging up out of the ground in Central America had this geometry, and sure enough, it did. Witch hats, dunce caps, all have this geometry. Isn't that fascinating? The dunce cap, to give you a brief story on that, was an invention of a 13th century priest named John Dun Scotus, who was from Scotland. And he noticed that when he put on the witch hats of common of the day, which have the exact same geometry, he had a higher or better connection to his higher self, to God, however you want to define it. And the Catholic Church didn't want to have any part of that. So they vilified his work and turned the dunce cap, which is actually an aid in achieving, higher, getting to know your higher self, turned it into an object of ridicule. So that was their way of handling this. Now we find headwear similar to this in the East as well. Here's an example. Shiva is one of the three deities in the Hindu religion, and we find that geometry and the headwear in this and numerous other examples in the book. Moving on to some contemporary architecture, we have the Chrysler Building in New York, which is an example. There are many more examples that somewhat predate the Chrysler Building, but it was about the last major building in the United States to have this geometry in the building. Here's an interesting one. Earlier this year, Amazon reported that they were going to be building a new headquarters on the East Coast in Arlington, Virginia. And what do you know? They picked a building with this very geometry in it. And we're going to see many more examples, several more anyway, today, of major corporations that are using this very geometry in their logos and buildings and so forth. So they know about this, but they're keeping it a secret from us. Disney World, every single Disney World park around the world has a castle, and every one of those castles uses 76-345 in its geometry. Here's a contemporary museum in Bonn, Germany called the Bundeskunsthalle. And you can see they have three of these pyramidal or conical objects in the middle of that. So I can't tell you if they just replicated this, copied it from the past, or whether they knew what they were doing. Here's an example of a Christmas tree. I used a professional made one, but if you get most Christmas trees that you buy to bring home for Christmas time are going to have this geometry as well. Here's something. I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania before the Steel Age was famous for their iron furnaces. Every one of the iron furnaces, not only in Pennsylvania, but throughout the United States, use this geometry. Again, it has a special property, and that property is maximizing airflow and therefore the heat generated inside the furnaces. Tesla. For those of you who know of Nikola Tesla, you know that he built Wardenclyffe Tower and that he was going to be making free energy with that. He was using resonance principles to achieve that. And of course, he got shut down by JP Morgan, and that's why we're all paying $250 to $500 a month now for our electricity bills. But interestingly enough, Tesla Motors has the same exact geometry in its logo. I can't believe that this is a mere coincidence. Here's an example of this geometry in current technology. I'm sure most of you have seen these power plant cooling towers. They're used to, what they do is for either coal or nuclear plants, they use steam to generate the power. And once that, rather than putting boiling water back into a stream or water, they try to cool it and recycle it. And that's what this does. If you had to actually run a big fan to suck the air through, it would be a very, very expensive process. So what they found out, no surprise, if you use this geometry, it optimizes the natural airflow through the system and produces the optimal cooling effects needed. Now we're getting into some real contemporary technology. All of our rocket ships and spaceships and so forth, they all have this. The space shuttle has this geometry. Here's a Saturn I rocket that has it. Here's a MiG-29 aircraft. So yes, the Russians know about this too. They all do. And here's again a Russian submarine that uses this in its nose. Obviously, Elon Musk knows about it because here it shows up in SpaceX as well. Here's a Sputnik aircraft, spacecraft from, I believe, the late 50s, early 60s that used this geometry as well. The reason I have this cathedral, and there are very, very few churches that are being built. In fact, if you go online and do a Google search for 21st century church steeples, you're not going to find a single one with this geometry. But the reason I have this one in is because the architect who built this, he didn't know about sacred geometry. What he did was he designed it on the Sputnik aircraft, spacecraft. So that's the way he got to the number. So even architects, you know, who build these beautiful buildings with this geometry don't know what they're doing in terms of the sacred geometric principles. And here's an example of a bullet. And a bullet has the same geometric principles. Native Americans knew about this too because it's in all of the arrowheads that we find. So they either came through this by trial and error, like we did to find all the geometry for all of these spacecraft and so forth, because they don't teach sacred geometry in engineering school. I've talked to aeronautical engineers, water engineers, audio engineers. None of them had sacred geometry, as did any of us in school either. So they obviously had to learn about this either through trial and error or through some advanced civilization who taught them. Kayaks have it as well. Alligators, there's tons of animals, alligators, crocodiles, porpoises, whales, and so forth. They all have this in their snout. Now for kind of the interesting part that I've thrown in today to talk about briefly. Pyramids, just like any tool, can be used for good or for evil. And I have known about the existence of a pyramid on the Maidan in 2014 during the coup. But I never had a picture of it, so I never wanted to disclose this until I saw it myself. But recently I was on Good Lion TV and saw this documentary called Putin versus the Deep State. And they had a bunch of information about and footage from the 2014 coup on the Maidan. And sure enough, here's this stick object, which turns out to have the exact geometry of that pyramid. Now, I had known about this for a while because on a website called pyramids.ru, which is the website that's maintained by the people who did the Russian pyramid research over the last 30 years. Dr. Alexander Golod was the guy who headed that team up. Well, there's an interview with him. So I just took a few excerpts from it to show you that this is for real. So he was asked this question: what connection could there be between the pyramid and the events in Ukraine? Remember, this is back 8 years ago. And Dr. Golod's answer was almost all of the time of the events on the Maidan, there was a pyramid. Now, this is translated through Google Translate, so I didn't want to mess with it. So it's a little funky. But he said, I think it was from February to June. He said, what is a pyramid anyway? Well, a pyramid is a tool. And like any tool, you must be able to use it. But using it, you can do both good and bad, or good and evil. So he was asked one other question: what could be the mechanism of influence of the pyramid on the Maidan? And his answer was, a person watches TV or sees the pyramid right on the Maidan. The pyramid allows the operator to broadcast the necessary information at the subconscious level. And I'll talk about that in a second. Here's the key again: there are no miracles, no magic, just pure physics. Now, what I figure was going on, if you go back to that picture, you couldn't see what was going on inside the pyramid, but we know from our own research that there are ways of producing what are called scalar waves, and that those scalar waves will bypass any subconscious blocks that you may have, and will allow that information to be processed subconsciously. Now, that can be good if you have a block for healing, for example, and you need to get around that. It's a wonderful way to do that. But as you can see, these people didn't hear anything with their ears, but they were being programmed for violence or rioting or whatever by the bad guys. So this technology, again, has been around for thousands of years. And I would dare say that every single major country around the world knows the exact result of specific frequency levels. And I'm quite concerned about 5G, what that can be, what's going to be going on there. I was listening to Mike Adams I think yesterday. He was interviewing somebody about 5G and how it might be used to in conjunction with the COVID jab. So anyway, very, very important that we become aware of these things and to start to educate ourselves and others that the world is not what we think it is. The only way that this information could have been hidden from us over the last couple hundred years, in my view, is that there was some major catastrophe, calamity that occurred over the last 500 years or so. Ever since the Gothic cathedrals, if you look through the architecture, especially neo-Gothic and contemporary architecture, we've essentially lost it. But at least the neo-Gothic architecture of, say, the late 19th century continued to use it, although I don't think they knew what they were doing. They were just copying, they were imitating. So we lost a huge source of knowledge over the last 200 to 500 years. There are plenty of historians on YouTube who go into that, and that's really outside of this discussion today as to what happened and when, but it's clear that this knowledge, which has been known for thousands of years, has escaped us within the last couple hundred. So That's about it for today. If you're interested, come see me. I've got copies of my book in the back. I also sell pyramids at stargatepyramids.com. If you're interested, use the coupon code TRUTH20 to receive 20% off of your order. And I thank you. And yes, Namaste has this geometry as well.